From my left is Glenn Carle. He served 23 years in the clandestine services in the CIA, in posts around the world and in Washington. He's the author of The Interrogator and Education, a book that details his own experience with post 9/11 interrogations. And he was telling us before we started that some lines from the movie he thinks maybe came right from him. So he'll tell you about that. Ann Hornaday is the film critic for the Washington Post. More than that, because that happens to be my hometown paper, and because I love the movies, but I don't get to go that often, I think of her as my personal film critic.
I would think of myself too.
I don't know what she thinks she's doing, but that's what I think she's doing. And Deborah, we've already heard the introduction, but our host who put this together, to put together the event and gathered us all here, assistant professor of law here at Cardozo, and importantly, previously to that, the founding director of the Law and Security Program at the group Human Rights First. I think I'll ask you all first, just to get everybody into this, the same first question is, what did you think of the movie? Deborah?
I had a similar experience in the sense that I found it impossible to watch as a movie. By the time I saw it, which was at the Washington premiere, I had read enough of the reviews, or at least the early discussions, that I think I had never dreaded seeing a film more. Both because I thought, and in fact, I think it was intensely painful in all of the directions. The voices on the black screen at the beginning is the most acute moment I think I have felt in film, and it is simply the audio recordings of voices from the actual audio recordings of people who were in the towers on 9/11 and didn't make it. So it was an acutely emotional experience. I'm sure it would be for anybody who saw it in that way. I found the film frustrating, and I guess most broadly, I want to say two things. One is I've worked on these questions of interrogation and torture from the human rights side and from the law side since 2002, when the first reports of detainee deaths in Afghanistan came out. And there were only two instances in that entire time I really felt like the national attention was focused on the question of torture. One was when the photographs of Abu Ghraib came out, and the second was the release of this film. And in that respect alone, I give it great credit and commend it to everyone's attention. Frustrating because given the attention film and art alone is able to focus on issues like this, I wish it had told a story that I thought was closer to the reality of those years.
Ann, who sees a million films a year. This is, in some sense, just another one, but in I guess in other ways, not just another one.
No, I thought the film was fantastic. I gave it a 4-star review, which I try not to give too often. I named it my favorite movie of 2012. I just thought it was just an incredibly immersive, subjective journey through this incredibly complicated decade that the filmmakers had to compress into 2.5 hours, ending with this almost virtually real-time raid in Abbottabad that I thought was absolutely lucid and coherent and troubling. It's densely layered. There is so much information that is contained in this film, both visual and in terms of just the pure narrative and the dialogue. But at the same time, it's very porous, allowing vastly different interpretations, which I think is a real strength of any work of art. So, just based on those sort of, I was speaking with Shmuel earlier about my criteria for judging a film and how do I keep it from being just subjective, like I liked it, I didn't like it. And it goes to 3 questions. One is, what were the filmmakers trying to achieve? Did they achieve it, and was it worth doing? And I think in this case, what Catherine Bigelow was trying to achieve was to really immerse us into this world and to thread us through this enormously complex but very crucial moment in our history. I think she did it beautifully, impeccably, and I think it was absolutely worth doing. In terms of what I took away from the film, in terms of do I think it did I come away with the same feelings?
We'll come back to
We'll come back to that.
that. Glenn, what do you think of the film?
The film had a huge impact on me, and when it finished, I sat in my chair until I think the whole theater had emptied. It recreated my life in many ways. No condensation of multiple operations and years in 2.5 hours can perfectly recreate 10 years of reality with hundreds of people who lived 10 years at a time. But it captured the ambiguity of enhanced interrogation as it was lived at the time, the lack of challenge to it because the orders had been given. This is what we had to do, and on we would go. Even though people involved often, many of them felt, is there a point to this? Doesn't this betray what we were supposed to be about? Is it not working? And people would conclude at the time that it wasn't. But one didn't challenge things like this except at great peril of one's own career. I thought it captured just about perfectly the sense of dedication and confusion and determination that all of my colleagues felt. I thought it got a couple of minor things wrong, but I guess little differences with a trajectory of a half-degree difference over time can have large consequences. It portrayed my colleagues, us, as more earnest and dour than we were. Even though we were talking about working on matters of life and death for 20-hour days for 10 years, the atmosphere and our approach, and it's not simply a stylistic one, I think it speaks to our characters even, and how we wrestled with life and death matters actually, was more akin to how the film portrayed the special operations officers, the banter that they engaged in, the lightheartedness in the midst of death was how we lived it day to day too, whereas I don't think Maya ever cracked a smile. And while doing all of these horrible things, we were all laughing, but not in any sick sort of way, because this is how one lives. You can't live without a smile. So I think that's the thing that bothered me the most, maybe.
Well, just to start us on this next question, how nuanced a portrait was it? What do you think it said about the torture or interrogation and its cause and effect ultimately on getting bin Laden?
I think there are two levels that the movie projects. The visceral one that John spoke about and both of you did before, which it creates the strong impression that most people will take away that torture was central to finding bin Laden and that it seems to have worked. The more muted message, the more subtle one, is also made in the film, which is that, well, wait a second. In fact, there's no direct cause and effect. And the lead interrogator, the fellow who played the role that I filled with a different case for a brief period of time, was far more muddled, not muddled in his thinking, but ambivalent about the utility, the morality, the efficacy. And there is no, if you look closely at the film, there is no direct link between anything that was attained through duress and anything that led to bin Laden. That point is clearly but subtly made. And a piece I wrote about the film, I didn't want to go there because, pardon me for sounding arrogant, most people will take away from watching the film what John and the rest of us did, which is, whoa, tough guys doing tough things in tough circumstances, and this is what you have to do, and it worked. That's not the message of the film. And that, therefore, the film accurately portrays.
Wait, why is that not the message of the film if many of us...
I totally agree.
Okay. Well, let me...
When,
Go ahead.
when you look at the film, I mean, I think everybody's focusing on that gripping opening sequence, but really when you watch it carefully, Glenn's absolutely right. The witness, the source, does not give anything up during the most brutal moments. When he's in the box, he keeps telling the wrong days. It's not until it's sleep deprivation, the confusion that results from the sleep deprivation, and a very clever bluff on the part of Maya and Dan
It's proper interrogation techniques.
Exactly. It's kind of that classical. That is what gives up this pseudonym of the Courier, which then leads Maya on this road. And if anything, and what really kind of hurts me, about the conversation, because like to me the bulk of the film is really the shoe leather intelligence gathering, the pickets along the Grand Trunk Road, which just blows me away in terms of the number of people it took to bring this off, and the fact that the real name was finally found in a file. I mean,
the story
that's
is
the story.
The story is a really subtle one, and it's a great triumph of the CIA, and all Americans should be really proud of this. It is this incredibly minute, intense, dedicated, sustained effort by thousands of men and women who put seemingly irrelevant pieces together in a way that paints a coherent picture. It's not from the tough guy, hard interrogation. The piece of information came across, and it's portrayed accurately in the film, from the way one does conduct a successful, honorable, and legal interrogation, and that is by establishing a rapport with a human being. Now, you can manipulate him, but you don't torture the guy.
I guess I want to jump in on what is the question of, does this tell a story about tough guys and tough techniques working and so forth? And I guess I think it's more, what I took away from the film was a slightly different picture than that. Yes, you're right, in the particular example you give, in the sort of central interrogation relationship that is depicted in the beginning of the film, the information that he conveys is not conveyed at the height of being tortured. It's conveyed after he's been tortured and is now having lunch and has been sort of restored to his humanity in some sense. But I think the film leaves the impression, right, that but for the fact that he had been tortured already and now the interrogators were holding out a sort of, literally a bone, in essence, that he wouldn't have conveyed that. And then, 15 minutes later or less than that in the film, there's a scene in which she asks a different detainee a question and he says, "I'm happy to tell you whatever you want to know. I have no desire to be tortured again." So there's that element just in those particular scenes, right? I mean, I understand why people view the film in the way they do, but for me, it was more than those particular scenes, right? It was the cumulative effect of what is she trying to do with the film and what are the choices she's made to include and what has she not included. So the film goes immediately from this just devastating audio to torture. That is the opening scene of the film, and it goes on for 15, 20 minutes. And you could have begun the story of the hunt for bin Laden anywhere. You could have started telling it in a courtroom. You could have started telling it, on a battlefield. You could have started telling it at the CIA before the attacks of 9/11. But she decided she wanted to juxtapose the emotional sort of devastation of 9/11 up against torture. And to me, the juxtaposition doesn't make torture look so bad.
But I think it's rooted in what John was getting at earlier. That was the context of the time. That was the tenor of the time. That was 5 or 6 months after 9/11. I think that does set up the emotional context of how that policy
But does it
came to be.
Does it leave people with the impression that but for the torture,
Well,
we
two
would
points
not
on
have
that.
gotten the information?
I think she was right to juxtapose the two or link the two, because as I lived it, and I didn't spend 10 years interrogating, I spent a number of months, but it was nonetheless the defining experience of my life, and I think of our nation in the last decade. This is the crisis that America faced and how it responded to it of the decade. You had this horrible event, 3,000 people moldering in Lower Manhattan. And what was our response? And who are we as a nation? Who are we as men and women? How do we live the oath that my colleagues and I took? And that's what we did. And the second point, and was it central or not? That gets to the second point, which is we would have the debates that you just had, which is, well, had it not been for these measures, then he wouldn't have talked when you asked him the sweet question. And others would say, that's total malarkey. Whether it's true or not, we don't do it. One, we mustn't do it. It's not who we must be. And in fact, that's a spurious association. And those issues were never fully resolved in-house. And I think the film accurately portrays that ambiguity.
Right.
We
But of course the
mustn't do
point-
it, but we did it, and you did it.
That's right.
So
We betrayed ourselves.
does the description that John Rizzo gave, was that your experience of very specific, here's what you're allowed to do, and that kind of oversight?
For me, no, but that doesn't, I'm not disagreeing with how John describes things. It was never a static, this is over a 10-year period, and the rules were not written once and then everything was always the same for ever after. I was involved in the very early days of interrogation before the programs were actually elaborated. And what I was told, there were no really rules at the time. Things were in place, but it hadn't been formalized. The formal training programs for interrogation hadn't yet even been implemented. So I was told, this is verbatim, and with the body language to go with it, you will do whatever it takes to get him to talk. Do you understand? Those are the rules that I had.
On the film, the point that you just made, that we were grappling with this right at the time, and the point you make, I think, really eloquently in your book about how, you yourself grappled with what are we doing, and is this working, and is this who we are, and all of those things. Those questions were real, right? People were, like you, were asking them in the very early days. Those stories are as fascinating and as real and as much a reaction to the events of 9/11 as the reaction, we got to get everything we should get, right? So you have, in the same way you have a story like Maya's, right, which is fictionalized. You have the story of Ali Soufan, who was mentioned before, right, who was in the room with Abu Zubaydah, the detainee, right, who was mentioned, and the story he writes in his persuasive and compelling book and subsequent testimony to Congress is, we were getting a great deal of information from this detainee until CIA came in and wanted to use these techniques, and the fight about which technique should we use and are we going to do this went to the director of the FBI. And all of that story was as much a part of what was happening as that, and as understandable, and none of that makes it into the film. Now that's a choice the filmmaker makes.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
a legitimate choice for a filmmaker to make. She has every right, et cetera.
You know,
For me,
that's a
though,
very important
it's a
point.
story I wish she had
Yeah, it
told
was a
her.
But I
It
think
was-
it would have completely changed. I do sort of not play the game, but I think one way to understand why this movie is so good is to imagine all the many ways it could have gone so wrong. And I would have loved to have seen that policy debate. I actually would have loved, especially when the deputy director is in the White House and talking to the security advisors. That would have been a good point for a more robust argument about the efficacy of the methods. I think, though, that that would have made the movie more about the policy debate,
But
and
this
that would
wasn't
have
a debate
also
at
made it much more polemical. And I think this, like you said, she makes this very strong aesthetic choice to keep it very purely on
But,
human action,
one of
and
the-
then we're to make of it what we will. But I just think to insert those arguments really would have. I just don't think aesthetically it would have fit what she was trying to do with this film.
One of the things that makes it a little bit more problematic, or at least raises questions, I mean, one of you said earlier that the film started with the voices from the Twin Towers, and then it started with torture. Actually, what it starts with is a graphic that says, based on firsthand accounts of actual events. Now that sets the mind right there. right?
And the point, right, I guess 2 points there. That's
telling
part
us
of why I
something.
find it, right, so troubling, because this is our first, as the director says, the first draft of history, right? And the debate I wish was included was not the policy debate or the law debate or the human rights debate, right? The debate that I was describing between Ali Soufan and the CIA were debates between interrogators, right?
Yeah.
These were the people who were in the room, and the only people you see in the room in the film are people who think, let's go.
Well, yeah, they should have made the movie based on my book, actually.
But
I'd support that.
But Jeff, that preamble based on the firsthand, that has really stoked a lot of the discussion about. I think that's the crux of the biscuit, as they would say in the South, which it gets into sort of my job as a reviewer. making that truth claim sets up a different aesthetic criteria, so that in addition to judging it as a work of art and as a work of entertainment, which I think it succeeds brilliantly in both cases, then and we've been grappling with this. We're living in a visual culture, in a media-centric culture. We're going to have, we have to constantly, like you said, with Argo and Lincoln, we're constantly having to evaluate these works on almost like a double level. And I think with Zero Dark 30, the level is you respond to it first as a film and as an immersive artistic experience, and then you sort of see how it aligns with the history. And does it align enough that we can form some sort of consensus that we can live with this? It's the same thing we did around All the
But
President's Men.
what's the
There are
standard?
probably
That's a different standard
there are
than,
probably
the students
investigators.
here or...
I'm sure there are FBI and congressional investigators who look at All the President's Men and say, "But we're not in that film. It's just it makes it look like two reporters brought down a president." That's reductive and it's not true. But as a society, over repeated use, we have decided that we're okay with that as being almost a metonym for Watergate and for that time. And I just think that's something that it almost, we do it individually, and then that adds up into this collective acknowledgement that it's, Mississippi Burning, a very atmospheric, another immersive film that took great liberties with the role of the FBI during the civil rights struggle. Enough so that for many people who were familiar with that, it was too much of a disparity with what they knew to be true, and they can't accept it as a powerful, I don't want to say document, chronicle of that time. I think the same thing will happen with Zero Dark 30.
Deborah's not buying
For good or
it,
for
I don't
ill.
think, but-
Yeah, no, I mean, I struggled with how I was going to write about this film. I struggled with how I was going to talk about this film because I'm a huge advocate of the arts and I'm a huge advocate of the First Amendment, right? And I think I would say maybe two things in response to that. First, both in those examples, Mississippi Burning and what's the other one? You get Lincoln, right? There's no...
All the President's Men.
And All the President, well, right, so arguably less morally fraught than torture and, and racism and slavery. There is no suggestion in Lincoln that the opponents of the 13th Amendment were the good guys. You can't get that out of the film. In this film, it's hard not to get whatever her internal feelings, which are unspoken and never articulated, and there is never an articulation of concern. You come away from the film after the last 20-minute heart-pounding that leads to the victory of the death of Osama bin Laden thinking, the torturer is the hero. And I worry for two reasons. One, I think like slavery, torture is not morally ambiguous for me, right? It should be in that same category, right? There shouldn't be a question here anymore. I didn't think there was. But secondly, it's because of the work that I did before, the role that Hollywood plays in influencing thinking about policy and practice is staggering, right? If you look at the opinion polls about torture and compare those people who, for example, watch 24, the series 24, to those people who don't, or more alarmingly, the people in the room, right? The military interrogators who went without instruction and said, oh, gee, Jack Bauer does this, I can do this too. That was, in fact, what happened. So we went to the head of West Point and said, "Can you retreat?
I wish
nearly as triumphalist as that. I don't take your point at all. I didn't come away thinking torture good.
No,
not at all. That's what I mean about thinking about all the many ways this could have gone.
Yeah,
so
but you
wrong.
aren't part of the 47%.
Play it that triumphantly. I'm sorry?
You aren't part of the 47%. And I'm not being completely a wise ass. I mean, I think
Which part of you is?
53%. No, I think that the visceral impression for most people is the powerful first scenes and narrative, which is tough guys succeeded and torture. Hey, it seems to have had this effect either indirectly because it softened the guy up or because it worked. And the more subtle point that you and I both agree on, I think we see, but I don't think we are the average moviegoer, and the general public won't get that. I'd like to, one point, I think the story you would like to have portrayed truly is, and this is not meant flippantly, the reality that I struggled with and lived, that I do portray in my book, which was which is starkly different, which is that people did say, hey, wait a minute, we can't do this. It doesn't work. We shouldn't be doing it anyway. However, I was an outlier. And my colleagues, and Ali, who's a friend and colleague of mine, was an outlier too. And in the scheme of the debates, we essentially lost. And what did define our actions was more portrayed in Zero Dark 30. And I think it's like the Seven Samurais. You know, what is reality? Reality is multiple things depending on where you're sitting. And my story is true, and I wish it had prevailed. And Zero Dark 30s is true, and it did prevail.
But to me, just even the ending, I mean, that last moment is so not played as for spiking it does not spike the ball. To me, it leaves you with a deep sense of ambivalence.
Yeah, I agree.
A deep sense of what have we done? Who are we now? And to me, it completely sets up the conversations we've been having about drones. I mean, it's just, so I don't get where people are thinking that, the audiences are running out of the theater whooping and saying, yay team. It so studiously avoids that, and it's so studiously throughout. I just think it's a really controlled, a much more controlled, emotionally nuanced.
I really agree with that, and to some extent, in that I credit her for trying to, not say everything and shape sort of ambiguous motivations and what's going on. And you're right, it ends quietly, which I appreciate. But I get it from two places. One, I get it from other reviews I've read of people who said, I came out of the theater like, yeah, go USA. So there is that reaction, and that's what leads me to say, it's the only piece of this she leaves unspoken. She has 15 characters who say, it's biology, everybody breaks, I don't want to be tortured again, I'll tell you whatever you want to know. What are we going to do now? There's no detainee program. How are we going to get intelligence? She gives voice to this is what we need to do, to 10 different characters. The only way you bring into the film the moral ambiguity and the uncertainty is if you bring it into the film, right? Now that's great. And it's great, in some respects, great filmmaking. But she didn't require you to bring into the film the torture is good thing. She just said it.
There's another point that ties comments that you had with John before this session with the movie and ours. The film doesn't portray at all, and it's important to the reality of how the CIA lived its own, the perceptions it had of the utility of the reporting from various detainees, in particular those who were subject to enhanced interrogation, is that I can speak to the question you asked about how useful was this stuff and how central.
I did want to ask you, yeah.
And
what's the answer?
The congressional report, it gets it right. That for years, they were viewed as the superstar assets sources who provided great information that did rocket to the president and sent our special forces guys off to do various kinetic things. That's true. But there were people in-house who said, wait a minute, this stuff is all rotten. We shouldn't be disseminating it to our policymakers at all. And then subsequently, it was found that there are all sorts of problems with the reliability of the information. First of which is that information obtained under duress is more suspect than that which is obtained under proper interrogation methods. And to my knowledge, just about every report, I retired in 2007, up to then was formally recalled by the CIA, which means a cable goes out, or a message goes out to the consumers of this intelligence saying, hold it, you have to give this stuff back, you must not use it in your policymaking because we have problems with it, it's all wrong.
So movie aside, you cannot say that what came out of these sessions led to getting bin Laden. That was not what did it.
Yeah, well, I retired before the actual case work was done that led to him. But my understanding from colleagues and from the work that I was involved in up to the time that I retired was that enhanced interrogation did not play a role in any part, really, of the mosaic that then did lead to finding bin Laden. No. And the movie portrays that, I think, ambiguously but accurately,
But some of the
that the information came from a conversation, not from a box.
But then when it got to the pseudonym of the courier, this is why I wish Mark Bowden were here. But I always thought that the different assets that provided the name of the pseudonym of the courier, that they had been interrogated under duress at some point.
Here's what I wish. Mark Bowden had a family emergency
Yes,
this afternoon.
12 months before he provided the information.
So couldn't make it. But what I think he would say, right, what he has written, then this is so dicey, but here's what he's written, right? What he wrote in his article about this was, it's unclear, but there are reasons to think that this was at least one of the sources where we got the pseudonym of the name that eventually led us, right, to the target. You know, the 3 senators who released the letter and the current director of the CIA said, the current director of the CIA said, we may never know, right? I don't think that's true. I think it's knowable, but it's knowable only to the extent you can find out whether somebody who was tortured ever said this name. It's not knowable to the extent, could we have gotten that information some other way? Would we have gotten that information some other way, right? And the 6,000-page study that one very much hopes the Senate will decide to make public at long last, that sort of documents this, has led senators on both sides of the aisle to say, this program wasn't worth it. It didn't work in that way, right? We would have gotten it anyway.
My own experience, you know, of course, is not universal, but is representative of what some of the messages, ambivalent or ambiguous messages, but still made in the film are, what Ali Soufan said and what the congressional report says, which is that the fellow I was interrogating was cooperating. How was I interrogating him? I was sitting like this for 17 or 18 hours a day and talking to him. And when, because of pressure, frankly, from headquarters, the decision was taken to, let's be tougher with this guy, let's get this final kernel of stuff that he's not giving up, he was then sent into enhanced interrogation universe. I was correct in what would happen. I said, if you do this, he'll just get pissed off and we'll say, you know, up yours, and I have nothing more to say, which is precisely what happened. It was a regression. And that's, why would someone cooperate when you're treating them miserably? Seems sort of a rather basic point to me.
I mean, Mark Bowden has said, you've said it, that he sees you can't say for sure, but it seems as though it was part of the mix. John Rizzo seemed to say, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but he said it's hard to imagine that after many years of this, it didn't lead to something, give some useful information.
Right. I believe the answer if the question is, will somebody who's being tortured ever tell you something truthful that's useful? I think the answer to that question is yes. Ever? Yes. I don't think that's the question we should be asking, because you could ask the same thing of, if you give somebody a Big Mac, will they tell you something truthful that might be useful? And the answer to that question is also yes, right? There's got to be something, you've got to ask a more fine-grained question than ever, will somebody say something that matters? And the studies that I've read that exist, right, because it's awfully hard to study this ethically. How do you torture someone ethically in a scientific context? You can't. The studies that I've read that have been done suggest occasionally somebody will say something truthful, often they won't. And here are a set of methods that have nothing to do with torture that seem to be enormously efficacious. So why would we go down this road, right? There is no scientific proof, and at best we're searching in a haystack for some anecdotal evidence that nobody has yet to really come up with in a concrete way that this ever worked. It's a pretty weak case.
Well, we all exist on the bell curve of psychological constitution and responses to various stimuli or pressures and so on. So there's no one answer to this. So some people, as the movie does portray, at the very evocation of torture or duress, will go, oh my God, and they will roll. And others, you can cut off their arms and they will not say anything. But there are so many reasons, practical, ethical, legal, so on, that argue against even those who are cowed or fearful or coerced into saying something, that there is really no justification to use it. And even if you do get the information, it's exponentially harder to evaluate. Information for an intelligence officer is meaningless until it is evaluated. You don't just send off the special forces guys, to someplace without deciding, well, how reliable is this? And it will be, by definition, less reliable if you're pulling someone's fingernails off.
I want to come back just in our last round here about, well, Deborah, you raised it with the question of 24, sort of how much does any of this matter? How much does it influence opinion? You were talking about well, let me just put it to you bluntly. Does a filmmaker have a responsibility beyond making a great film? Do you think of Catherine Bigelow as having some responsibility to say something beyond her art to in a way that speaks to the general public, that will feed and enhance the kind of discussion we have about an issue like this?
Oh, I do, and I especially think that I think she and Mark Bowl, the screenwriter, when they put that disclaimer up, then they're letting them, then they're setting up the parameters of they're absolutely, they've put themselves in this position of having to defend any kind of truth claims that they're making with this, and I think they're ready to do that. But I personally think that they have acquitted themselves in a responsible fashion. But again, this is going to be, I think it's just so open to all these varied interpretations. And then again, I'll repeat that I think that's a measure of what a great piece it is that people can come away with these but I definitely think that film, I was speaking with Leon Wieseltier once about films about the Holocaust, and he has this great phrase about cinema's ability to colonize the imagination. I mean, I think unlike any other art form, it can burrow its way into our consciousness and our memories of an event so that a film can sort of symbolize that event going forward. And that's what I was getting at with the All the President's Men analogy. And so, to the degree that the people who were intimately involved with these events are okay with are okay with this movie and kind of feel like, yeah, it took some liberties, but generally it got the context right. It sets up the context for these activities. It sort of limes all the the major points along the way. Then I think that. I saw that Jane Harmon sort of, gave it an endorsement today. She's seen it 4 times and thinks it's, so I just think that not that she's the last word, but, that lends it some credibility, with people with some intimate knowledge of this stuff.
But your fear of it, your critique, it only matters, I guess, is if the general public comes away with a sense, what you think is a wrong sense.
Well, right. So, part of this is how much do you trust the general public to bring to the film, right? And the answer is, who knows, and why is that our responsibility to worry about? Here's what I wish would have happened. Either I wish she would have put the debate that happened in the booth into the film, right? As if, this was not as if that part existed, of the history existed. Or if she decided not to do that and to leave that unsaid, that she, with the release of the film, said, here's what we reported, here's what I decided to include in the film, here's what I didn't decide to include, and here's why. But instead she said, of course torture is reprehensible, but these people are heroic. And what worries me about that is not just the draft of history. I hope there will be more. I hope there is not consensus around this draft. But the people who do this today in the field as we speak, right? Who go to the movies just like everybody else, and who, if post 9/11 media watching was an example, took from the depictions of torture that this works and we should do more of it. I would like there to be a similar message accompanying the film that, there are a host of reasons not to do more of it, and here's a moment in which we could all learn why.
Do you think your former colleagues are susceptible to the wrong message?
I think the public is, my colleagues less so. I mean, we have our own opinions seared into us from our firsthand experiences. But one of the things I say when I go around talking about the message, I hope, of my book and my experience is that when polls, I think this is from Pew and from Quinnipiac University and others, ask Americans who are 35 and above, should American officials, CIA officers, torture to protect us? A strong majority of 35 and above Americans say, absolutely not. These guys take their oath to protect us from that sort of horrible stuff. You ask Americans 35 and below the same question, and the majority of them say, it's okay. These guys have to do what they have to do. Why? Two reasons, I argue. One, for 10 years, as these people came of age, they heard all of our leaders saying, we are in danger and we will protect you, we'll do what it takes. And that's what it took. And two, 24. They watch 24, and they say, oh, it's just a TV show, but it shapes their subconscious and conscious impressions. And we've even seen it with our soldiers, who then see the movie and go off and think that this is just what John Wayne did to me when I was a kid. It's okay. So I'm troubled by that.
You know, art, great art anyway, I don't know about 24, but, which I enjoyed, I don't mean that.
I will watch it.
Well, I watched one part of one season, so that's as far as I'm going. Anyway, but great art often takes a long time to digest history. And I wonder, I'll ask you this, I'm thinking of, you know, Homer was writing about events, whether they were partly based on reality or mythological, but they were a few hundred years in the Bronze Age in the past for his time. Shakespeare's great history plays were written about events a couple of hundred years before his time, commenting on things happening. Recently, I talked to Tim O'Brien, his great book on the things they carried, and hadn't even occurred to me, but he didn't write that till about 15 or 20 years after Vietnam. I didn't realize that. We haven't seen a lot. I'm thinking, we're talking about this film and why it is so sort of gritty, because it's so real right now. Is there more do you know why we haven't seen much yet? Or is there more coming? Or do you think we will see a lot more on this period?
I do, and this was a sort of a special case because they had been working on another film that was really going to be centered around Tora Bora and the failure to get bin Laden at that point. And literally, Mark Bowl was working on that screenplay, and they were in pre-production for that movie on May 1st, 2011, at which point he threw that draft away and started from scratch. And that's why the first-hand accounts, because he's a former journalist and has a lot of sources in the military and intelligence communities. And I think he just worked his Rolodex and behaved like a reporter. I should add that his previous films were In the Valley of Elah and The Hurt Locker, both of which were also based on his experiences as an embedded reporter in Iraq. So that's I think that was his instinct, and I think was also sort of a challenge to see, well, what would this be like if we reported this script? So it almost, I think he was working on that screenplay almost in real time alongside the journalists like Mark Bowden and Peter Bergen, the reporters who were reporting out that same story. So this is a very strange, the fact that it came out so quickly after the actual events it's depicting is really extraordinary, but he has since announced that he's starting a production company to do more of same. And I'm interested to ask him after all of this pushback. I haven't spoken to him in a couple of months, but I haven't spoken since he announced this production company, but I'm really curious if he has any sense of wanting to do it differently, wishing that he had done it. I will ask.
That'd be great.
If I could ever speak with either of them, because I think it's really been I honestly don't think that they were expecting this reaction. I really, truly don't. But yeah, I think that and I was just interviewed, there's a wonderful documentary that's out now called The Gatekeepers about Shin Bet, about the Israeli Secret Service. And the director it's a documentary, it's based, it's based on these interviews, but that filmmaker wants to get into the fictional realm and tell these stories. So I think it's I think journalism is migrating into lots of different forms, and feature films is definitely going to be one of them.
John Rizzo, do you have any comments before I bring this around? Okay.
I will. You know, in many ways, I wish we had never started down this road. I mean, in the interrogation program. It is certainly, of all the controversies I was involved in during the course of my CIA career, this was by far the most portentous. And as time went on and the controversy grew, there were criminal investigations, careers were affected. And honestly didn't do a lot for my career ultimately, and I became defined not for what I'd done for my previous 25 years, but my actions in the post 9/11 era. So all of that, in many ways, I wish I'd never. I mean, as I say, the agency would have been better off had we never gone down that road. But I will just repeat: in February and March 2002, the fear, the dread, especially in the city, about another attack was all pervasive. There was a guy we had in custody. Our experts concluded he was holding back information about another attack. I could have, when those techniques were first proposed, basically said, "You guys are crazy. These are immoral. They're going to get us into huge trouble. Let's just not do them." Now, had there been a second attack, and in that postmortem, it would have been hard for me to countenance the possibility that Zubaydah knew about that second attack. We didn't get the information out of him, and the reason we didn't is because we decided we could not go forward with admittedly very aggressive, unprecedented procedures. And that's what we did. That's what I did. So that was 10 years ago.
We only have a few minutes, and because we're in a school, it would be nice if we have a few questions from students. Are the students over here? Are you students? Are there any questions that any students would like to ask? Yes.
Do I think that was enough? In other words, enough of a way of portraying it? It's a great question. I wish you'd ask some of the other panelists. Okay, bonus points for you.
It was pretty transparent.
Yeah, that was. See, I should have seen through it. I should have read that. You know, I don't, for two reasons. One, I don't trust not only myself, right? I don't trust anybody to read what you read into it. She said at the opening of the premiere in D.C., Bigelow came and spoke, and she said something to the effect, and this is a pretty close paraphrase, you know, I'm a filmmaker. I had no agenda. I put stuff out there, and it's up to people to interpret, right? And in almost every circumstance in which, right, filmmakers make films, I buy that. In fact, I endorse that. In this circumstance, having watched the consequences of film on interrogation, not just the policymakers, but the practitioners, right? No, I thought it needed to be more than that. And again, it could have happened after the film. It could have happened in many ways sort of during the film. But the cumulative effect of the film and not just those moments of hesitation, but the many moments in which it was action and effective action, I thought outweighed any message, any quiet message, that would have overcome sort of the "we got him" victory.
I'm still not seeing the effect. I don't think of it as effective. I just don't see it. I feel like I'm seeing a different film than people. I do. I really do. I've seen it 3 times now, and I've gone because I am more probably ideologically or philosophically like you. You know what I mean? Than not. And I literally have gone looking, trying to see it, and I don't see the cause and effect, that strong cause and effect. And I also don't think, I have also never seen 24, but my impression is that 24 was definitely, the ticking time bomb scenario and torture him and you get and this is not, I just don't think the comparison is fair at all. This has
better
way
art
too,
than 24.
it is better.
Yes.
And it's also much more nuanced in terms of that great swath of drama that nobody talks about, which is the pickets and the sources and the assets and the computers, sitting in front of a computer screen. I mean, that, in terms of minutes spent, that gets much more attention in the film than these scenes of brutality. So I just think in terms of the ratio of what's dramatized and what you see Maya doing, it favors the shoe leather way more than the
I will say,
spectacular brutality.
As portrayed in the movie, my workspaces were worse than Maya's.
Wow.
And the interrogation facility was also much more daunting and frightening.
Was much more daunting and frightening.
I was going to end, but that's a pretty bad place to end. But I am a believer in getting on and off the air at the right time. It is 7:30. That's our time. So thank you. We'll continue talking out in the reception area. Thank you all, and thank you all again.